All right, so chapter 2. All right, so when we're thinking about system, what we're doing is just talking about basically any sort of connection of different pieces. So when we're looking at it in terms of environmental science, we're going to be looking at ecosystem. So those connected pieces are going to be the different organisms, so the animals, the plants, as well as the environment itself. So the could be, as we see here, a river or lake, whatever that's going to be, the atmosphere, the soil. So it's going to be the entire collection of the environment. And then when we're thinking about a system in general, so this could be in terms of physics, it could be environmental science, just chemistry, whatever it's going to be. We can define it in a couple different ways. So what we're going to see in the environmental science field, we're mostly going to be dealing with open systems because the environment itself is open. Things are able to kind of move between those different pieces. So with open systems, we're going to see that matter is able to move. So we're able to have organisms, we're able to have different substances move from one area to another. The same thing with energy. So we can have heat flow, different forms of energy as well. But with open systems, we're going to see a transfer of matter and energy. With closed systems, we're still going to see the ability for energy to be transferred. So we can still have heat move in or out of a system. But we're not going to be able to have the matter move. So with closed systems, we're only looking at the transfer of energy. And then with isolated systems, we're not going to see either. But again, with environmental science, typically going to be focused mostly on open systems. One example of a closed system that I can think of off the top of my head, kind of like what we're looking at here, would be maybe a system such as a lake in winter, where the top of the lake freezes, but the rest of the water remains liquid. That could kind of be considered a closed system in the sense that we're not going to have anything sort of moving in or out of the water itself in terms of matter, but we could still have energy flowing between them. And then with that flow of energy or the flow of matter, either one, whether it's going into, out of, just passing through a system, we're going to consider that throughput. So any sort of flow of energy or matter can just be thought of as throughput. And again, with the open systems, we'll see both of those things are able to be moving about. With the closed system, it's just heat, and the isolated system, it's neither. And then if you can see this up here, what they're showing is just O2. And the reason they're showing that is in this case, it looks like these containers are supposed to represent the level of water with that blue line. So this is showing that oxygen is able to actually move from the atmosphere. It's able to dissolve into the water itself. So if you think about dissolved water, or dissolved oxygen, not dissolved water, but dissolved oxygen, that's what allows the fish and different things living in the water to breathe. So that's kind of what they're showing here. And then with these systems, just a couple of simple terms that we'll want to have is equilibrium, just referring to a system in balance. So equilibrium kind of has equal in the front there, kind of makes you think of something that's going to be balanced. If you think about a mathematical equation, if it's equal, that means the left side is equal to the right. We have that balance. That's what we're thinking about in terms of an equilibrated system. It's going to be a stable system. It's going to be that ideal balance. And in a system of equilibrium, when we have that balance, the populations of any organisms within that system, we're going to see are going to stay relatively constant. And that's why we're going to consider an equilibrated system. It's going to have that nice balance. It's going to have that constant population. And with constant population, it's not going to stay exactly the same thing, but it's not going to go massively higher, massively lower. But with these systems, in some cases, we're going to see thresholds, sometimes known as tipping points. And these are going to be points where rapid change occurs. And it's going to be when a certain tipping point, a certain limit has been reached, has been exceeded. So if we go back to the dissolved oxygen in water, that's going to have to be at a certain level in order to support the aquatic organisms living in that water. And if that dissolved oxygen level slowly decreases over time, we're probably not going to notice it much at first, but then it's eventually going to hit a tipping point. And the reason we're not going to notice it much at first is because the organisms are still going to be able to survive. They might be breathing a little bit more heavily or whatever it's going to be, but they're still going to be able to survive, just not sort of ideally. But eventually it's going to hit a point where if that oxygen level decreases enough, there's not going to be enough oxygen for those organisms to survive no matter what. And at that point, we're going to see a whole bunch of those fish start to die off. And that's why we're considering a tipping point, because we see a very rapid change once we get over whatever that threshold is going to be. And then some more terminology, a feedback loop. So a feedback loop is just going to be something where the effects of an initial change lead to more or less of that initial change. So if we look at the example we have here, and it can be positive or negative. So this is going to be an example of a positive feedback loop, because a positive feedback loop is going to result in more of that initial change. So here, the initial change is going to be the temperature rises. And then when that occurs, the Arctic sea ice melts. And when that occurs, it goes from the white ice to the darker sea color, darker watercolor. And what that's going to do is it's going to result in the absorption of more of that light. So whereas the ice allowed the sunlight to reflect off, the water itself is going to absorb more of that light. And as a result, it's going to absorb more of that heat. So we're going to see the temperature rise again. We're going to see more of that Arctic sea ice melt. We're going to see more of the absorption of that light because there's more of that darker colored water. And again, we're going to see the temperature continue to rise. So this is considered a positive feedback loop, excuse me. Not because the result is something that we want, not that it's something that it's good, but it's considered positive in the sense that that initial change, the temperature rising, led to an effect that amplified the initial change. So since temperature rising caused these two things to occur, which then caused the temperature to rise further, that's why it's considered a positive feedback loop. So the positive doesn't have to be something good. It's just going to be an increase of whatever that initial change was. Whereas a negative feedback loop, if I can get this to click, there we go. A negative feedback loop, we're going to see, again, doesn't mean that it's necessarily going to be a bad thing. It's just going to be the initial change. Those effects are going to lead to less of whatever that thing is. So again, we're going to be looking at climate change. We're going to be looking at the climate warming, so the temperature increasing. What that's going to do is lead to more evaporation of water. So if you think about it, if we have higher temperatures, more of that water is going to evaporate. So we're going to have an increase in the no, this is the wrong picture. Whoops. This is also going to be a positive feedback loop. Whoops. I put the wrong picture up here. So this is going to be also a positive feedback loop, because if we look, it's going to wind up with more climate warming. But if we had some sort of change that resulted in a decrease in temperature caused by an increase in temperature, that would be a negative feedback loop. And what we're going to see is a negative feedback loop coming up on one of these next slides. Actually, this is going to be a sort of a combination of the two. And we're going to see the reason it's going to be a combination of the two is because this is how population sort of maintain themselves. So if we think about it, we can start at any point on this sort of diagram and just follow it clockwise. I'm just going to pick the top left here. So if we start with abundant prey, so we're looking at, looks like a lynx maybe, and then some rabbits, some hare. If we've got abundant prey, so we've got a lot of these prey, that means we can have a lot of the predators. So if we've got a lot of this prey, that means these predators are going to reproduce more and more, and their population is going to increase. But what that's going to do is then cause the prey population to decrease, because there's going to be a whole bunch of these predators hunting them. So the population of this prey then is going to dramatically drop, which is then going to cause the predator population to drop as well, because there's not a lot of the prey for them to eat, so there's not something that can support them. That's going to lead to starvation and death via starvation ultimately for a lot of these predators, which is then going to allow the prey population to rebound. So we'll see that population increase again, which is then going to continue this cycle to allow the predator population to bounce up again. And if we look at it on this next slide, we can kind of see it visually. So the blue represents the prey. So those would be the rabbits or the hare. And the red is going to be the predators. And we can see they're slightly offset because the prey is going to get to that high population, and then the predators are going to reproduce. But they're never going to be sort of on that same line, because the reproduction and then ultimately the time it takes for them to starve, and then for the prey to rebound and that cycle to continue is always going to be offset by a little bit. So that's why we're seeing that these two peaks don't line up exactly. The same thing with the valleys as well. They're going to be offset by a little bit because these relationships are going to be in response to one another, and it's going to take that a little bit of time for the prey population to respond to the predators and vice versa. But again, we can see as one goes up, the other is going to increase, which then causes the other to go down, and the same thing happens again. And then just move this. With this, we're going to be looking at matter as well. So we're talking about systems. We can have energy move between them. But matter is going to be what we can actually sort of physically touch. Anything that's got mass, anything that takes up space. So things like energy are not going to be considered matter. So light, sound, ideas aren't considered matter because they're not tangible. They don't have mass. They don't take up space. But the world we live in, the computer that I'm using right now, the chair I'm sitting in, all of that stuff is going to be example of matter. You're considered matter. And just anything that you can actually physically touch is going to be considered matter. Even the air we breathe, you may not think about it as having much mass, but it does have a small amount of mass. It is taking up space. It's filling the entire volume of the room. So that's also going to be considered matter. But with matter, we can kind of subdivide it into a couple categories. And with this, it's actually going to be kind of building upon itself. So atoms are going to be, elements are going to be specific types of atoms. And then molecules and compounds are going to be a collection of those atoms and elements. And with this, you may be somewhat familiar with it. If you've already taken chemistry, these terms are probably something that you're already aware of. If you've never taken chemistry before, you've probably heard of these terms before, but may not exactly know what they are. So we'll go through them a little bit quickly. You can see on the left side here is just an example of an atom. This isn't totally representative of what a true atom would look like if we kind of actually zoom in and see one, because they're extremely, extremely small. But it does do a good job of kind of showing those different pieces. So in the middle, we've got what's known as the nucleus. And with these atoms, I should say they're made up of 3 subatomic particles. So if we think about subatomic, the prefix sub just means below. So subterranean just means below Earth, because terranean just is referring to the Earth. So subatomic just means below the atomic scale. So these are the pieces that actually make up atoms. We've got 3 subatomic particles, the proton, the neutron, and the electron. And then in the central piece of this nucleus, we've got 2 of those. So we've got the proton and the neutron. The proton is positive, the neutron is neutral, so it's got no charge. And then on the outside, they're showing them on these rings, which you can, again, they kind of represent, it's not perfect, but it does a decent enough job. That's where we've got the negative charged electrons. So the electrons and the electrons and the protons, excuse me, balance out the charge, and all 3 of these make up the atom as a whole. And then, like I was saying, elements are just going to be specific versions of different atoms. I guess I could have gone to this one before, but atoms are just the building blocks of matter. So anything that is matter made up of these different atoms. And then with these atoms, like I was saying, the 3 subatomic particles, the subatomic particle that's actually going to determine what element a specific atom is going to be the protons. So depending on how many protons are in an atom, that's what determines if an atom is going to be carbon or oxygen, nitrogen, whatever element it's going to be. There's 118 of them. 92 of them are naturally occurring. But the way we determine exactly which element it is based on how many protons are in that nucleus there. And that's what's known as the atomic number. So for example, if you look at this one, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, it worked out well because it's the example I have here. This atom here looks like it's got 6 protons on it. So it would have an atomic number of 6. And any atom with an atomic number of 6, any atom with exactly 6 protons is going to be a carbon atom. If we had 2 more protons in there, so if it had an atomic number of 8, that would be oxygen. But whatever that number is, that's how we determine what element it is. And if you know the atomic number, you could always just look at a periodic table and just see where that element is. But with these elements, so like I said, carbon has an atomic number of 6. So any atom rather, that has 6 protons is always going to be a carbon atom. Exactly 6 protons, I should say. But with it, that also means it's going to have 6 electrons because it needs to balance out the charge. You can have different numbers of protons and electrons, but then it's an ion rather than an atom, and that's going to be something we're not going to deal with right now. But any atom that has exactly 6 protons is going to be carbon, so it's also going to have 6 electrons. But the third subatomic particle, the neutrons that don't have any charge, those can actually vary in different atoms. And when we have that occur, when we've got a carbon atom, for example, that's got different number of neutrons, those are referred to as isotopes. So if we look here, we've got what's known as carbon-12, carbon-13, carbon-14. And the reason we've got those different numbers there is because the number refers to the mass of the atom. And the mass is just determined by the number of protons plus the number of neutrons. So in carbon-12, we've got 6 protons because it's carbon, which means we also have 6 neutrons because it's got the mass of 12. And again, we've got 6 protons in each of these because they're also carbon. But in carbon-13, we've got a 7th neutron. Carbon-14, we've got an 8. So these are all going to be isotopes because we've got the same atomic number. We've got carbon in each 3 cases, in all of the 3 cases, excuse me. But we've got a different number of neutrons, so they're not exactly the same type of atom. And then what I also want to point out here is if you look, we've got different percentages. So carbon-12, 98.9%, carbon-13, 1.1%, and then carbon-14, less than 0.1%. So basically, very, very little of carbon is going to be carbon-14. The reason I want to point this out is just because with these different isotopes, and the same thing if we look at isotopes of any element, they're going to be in different abundances. And that's going to be related to the stability of these different isotopes. And the stability of them is just going to be directly related to the proton to neutron ratio. So some ratios are more stable than others. And in this case, the 6 and 6 of carbon-12 going to be much more stable than the 6 and 8 of carbon-14. And with these, some of the isotopes are going to be radioactive. That allows them to have different uses. So like carbon-13, you may be familiar with if you've taken something like earth science. So carbon-13 dating. Other isotopes sometimes have medicinal purposes, so they can be used as tracers throughout the body. Some of them are used in nuclear energy. But with these isotopes, just in general, we're looking at the same element. So it's got the same atomic number, but it's going to have a different atomic mass because it's going to have a different number of neutrons. And then with those atoms, those elements, once we take them and start combining them together, we can form what are known as compounds and molecules. A compound is just going to be a collection of 2 or more elements. So if we look at something like carbon dioxide, that would be considered a compound. because we've got carbon and oxygen bound together. A molecule is going to be compounds, but a molecule can also be the same two elements together. So if we look at the oxygen we breathe, for example, the oxygen when we breathe isn't just oxygen, it's actually O2. There's two oxygen atoms bonded together. So that's going to be considered a molecule because it's got those two atoms, but it's not going to be considered a compound because those two atoms are the same thing. Same thing if we look at, if you're familiar with ozone, the substance higher up in the atmosphere that kind of helps protect us from some of the sun's ultraviolet rays. The chemical formula for ozone is O3, so it's three oxygen atoms bound together. That again would be an example of a molecule because it's multiple atoms, but it wouldn't be a compound because it's still just that one type of element. But again, carbon dioxide would be a compound and a molecule because it's multiple atoms bound together, and it's two different elements. We've got carbon and oxygen. Same thing with glucose, even more complex. We've got C6H12O6, so we've got 24 atoms in total. We've got three different types of elements, so that would be an example of a compound and a molecule. So that's why it's saying all compounds are molecules, but not all molecules are compounds, because molecules can just be the same elements. It's kind of like all thumbs are fingers, but not all fingers are thumbs. And then probably the most important compound or molecule is going to be water. So water is going to be an extremely polar molecule. And with polar, what we're looking at is oxygen is actually going to wind up having a negative charge on it. And then each of the two hydrogens, if you look at it here, it's kind of like a Mickey Mouse head upside down. Each of these two hydrogens, and this actually is kind of what water looks like if we could blow it up and look at it on a larger scale. We would see well, we wouldn't see it, but oxygen would be negative. Each of these two hydrogens on the other end would have a slight positive charge on them. And because of that, it allows water to really stick to itself. What we'll see is water actually kind of arranges itself so that the hydrogen of one water molecule, that positive hydrogen, is going to be closer to the negative oxygen of another. And they'll kind of link up like that and have the opposite charges attract. That's going to allow it to be cohesive or stick together. So that allows for capillary action, that allows it to be drawn up into small channels. So that's why plants can kind of have it transported through their, like trees, for example, can have it pulled up through the roots all the way to the leaves at the very top. And this polarity also allows it to dissolve a whole bunch of different substances in it. And the most important thing is probably the high boiling point, high freezing point of water, because it's got those strong intermolecular forces. It takes a lot of energy to vaporize it. That's why sweating cools you down. It takes that energy away from your body to actually turn it into a gas. And it also is very slow to change temperatures. So that's important, particularly with bodies of water. They don't get heated up or cooled down too quickly. It allows the animals to adapt. It also prevents freezing in some cases. And then sort of a weird property of water that's not really found in, I can't think of any other substances, but I'm sure there might be a few others. But a really weird exception of water is that when it freezes, so when we go from the liquid to the solid phase, when that occurs with most substances, they become more compact. So they become more dense. And then that's why most solids sink in the liquid form of whatever that may be. But with water, when it freezes, it actually crystallizes and expands. It becomes larger. That allows ice to float. And that's extremely important for aquatic life. Otherwise, the top of the water wouldn't freeze, and it would be exposed to much harsher conditions. And if it did freeze, anything would just sink and kind of could cause issues with that too. But and then other substances that we're going to be talking about throughout this are just acids and bases in general. So acids, just so you're aware, are going to be anything that increase the concentration of hydrogen ions. So H+, that's why it's called pH. P is just the negative logarithm of the hydrogen ion concentration. That's what the H is. Bases are going to be OH minus, so that's hydroxide. So if you look at those two pieces, H plus, OH minus, plus and minus are going to cancel out to neutral. And then H and OH, we wind up with H2O, because water can actually act as an acid or a base depending on what it's mixed with. But with these, we'll see that acids are going to be particularly damaging to living tissue. We'll see things like acid rain, where they can also be destructive to structures, to different organisms as well, but structures, statues, depending on what they're made of. And then we'll also see systems that are what are known as buffered, which just means that they're resistant to pH changes. So some lakes are buffered, which means they don't really get affected if there was acid rain. Others aren't going to be buffered, which means the pH could dramatically change if acid rain was to occur. And then organic compounds. If you've taken organic, or I don't think GHC has offered organic chemistry in a couple of years, so you probably haven't taken it unless you've taken it at another school. But organic chemistry is just focused pretty much on the study of chemistry, or the chemistry of carbon-containing compounds. So if we look here, we've got what's known as a carbon skeleton or a carbon backbone, because we've got this central structure with a whole bunch of carbons bonded together. But then depending on what we have coming off of those different carbons, we could have a carbohydrate, we could have a lipid, a nucleic acid, protein, whatever it's going to be. And these different organic compounds are going to have different functions in the different organisms. So for example, carbohydrates, just like pasta and things like that, generally used as an energy source. Nucleic acids used in DNA, proteins used in a whole bunch of different processes. Same thing with lipids. But when we're thinking about organic compound, you just want to think about carbon in general. That's going to be the main focus, but we will have these different elements mixed in there. And then these aren't the only ones, but they're the most common: hydrogen, oxygen, and then we'll talk a lot about nitrogen and phosphorus as well. Not so much in the sense of organic compounds, but those are environmentally important nutrients. And then, like I was saying, the nucleic acids play a big role in DNA. This is going to be what's responsible for passing on the different traits from parent to offspring. That's going to be important when we look at adaptations and natural selection, evolution, and things like that. And like I said, nitrogen and phosphorus are key nutrients, not only in plant growth, like I was saying with the nutrients, but they're going to be important in these different nucleic acids. And then with this, we're not going to look too much at the different cells, but you're probably familiar with these already. The big main difference, the plant cells do have the cell wall around them, whereas the animal cells just have the cell membrane on the outside. Like I was saying, matter is anything that has mass and takes up space. Energy is what actually helps provide the forces that either hold those pieces of matter together, move them from one place to another, tear them apart, whatever it's going to be happening to that matter is going to be happening because of energy, but the matter itself is the object. And then when we're looking at energy, there are a couple of different units, and you always want to make sure you're paying attention to what the units are, especially with something like energy that can vary. Typically, what we're going to see is the joule. So the capital J, maybe kilojoule, so it may have a lowercase k in front of it. In that case, it would be equal to 1,000 joules. But that's a pretty standard unit for energy. And that's actually equal to, if you're familiar with physics, if you've taken that before, it's going to be a kilogram meter squared per second squared. But if we're looking at describing it in terms of heat, we often use the term calorie instead. So if we think about calorie from a perspective of food, it's just the amount of energy that is needed to increase 1 gram of water 1 degree C. And then with energy, again, not classified as matter. But there are a whole bunch of different types of energy. So chemical energy, things, the energy in stored bonds, electromagnetic energy, the light that's being given off by the sun, for example, gravitational energy, sonic energy is just sound, mechanical energy, the energy of movement, similar to kinetic energy, potential energy, somewhat related to gravity, and then nuclear energy, we're going to look at later in the quarter. But thermal energy probably be the most familiar just because that's related to heat. And with heat, thermodynamics, if you think about it, just the movement of heat essentially. So thermo referring to heat, dynamics, movement. So with the laws of thermodynamics, we're just trying to get a better understanding of the way heat moves throughout the universe. And we've got a couple different laws to kind of explain those processes. The zeroth law, two systems in equilibrium with a third system are in thermal equilibrium with each other. So if we look at this picture, it kind of looks a little bit complicated, but thermal equilibrium just means that they have the same essentially amount of heat in them. So heat's always going to, if we look at the bottom here, get ahead of ourselves, heat's always going to flow from hot to cold. So cold's not actually a thing. It's just the absence of heat. So when you feel the cold, for example, if you in the wintertime open a window and then your arm feels cold next to it, it's not because the cold's coming in, it's because your body's actually losing heat. So if we go back to the zeroth law, what equilibrium's saying here is that there's going to be no net flow of heat essentially. If any heat flows from the house to the car, for example, the same amount of heat is going to flow back from the car to the house. So if those two are in equilibrium, and then the car is also in equilibrium with this boat, that means by extension, we can surmise that the house and the boat are also going to be in equilibrium with each other. The first law, the conservation of energy, you're probably familiar with this one, but if you're not, no worries. It's just saying that the energy, the total amount of energy within the universe is constant. It's never going to change. It's never going to go up or down at all. But what is going to occur is the energy is going to change from one form to another. So if we go back for a second, oops, there we go. We've got all these different forms of energy. If we were, and there are other ones as well. If we were to add up all of these different types of energy throughout the entire universe, we would have some amount of energy, and that's going to be a constant. But if we were to look at one of these specifically, we could see that change, because we could see, for example, when you're on a swing, when you're at the very top, so when you're on the backswing, you get all the way to the top, for a moment, you're motionless. At that moment, you've got zero kinetic energy. All of your energy is going to be potential. But then as you start to flow back down, you're converting some of that potential energy back into kinetic. And then as you go back up to the top on the other end, you're having that conversion back again. And then since it's not a frictionless system, you're also going to be having some of that energy converted into heat energy just due to the swing moving itself. But the total amount of energy is going to be constant. It's just going to be changing between those different forms. And we've got a similar law related to the conservation of mass, conservation of charge. Those things are never going to change when we're looking at the total system in terms of the universe, but we can see them change if we focus on just one little aspect. I already talked about the second law. And then the third law, entropy of a system approaches a constant as temperature approaches absolute zero. So with absolute zero, it just means that there's absolutely no movement. It's the lowest possible temperature. Everything, essentially, every atom has a little bit of vibration to it, a little bit of movement to it. But if we could get to absolute zero, that movement would completely stop. And as we approach that temperature, entropy is just the disorder of a system. We see that entropy approach just a constant. With this, though, I would say probably the ones that we're going to be most focused on throughout the quarter are probably definitely the first law, just this conservation of energy. And then we'll also be thinking about the second one a little bit as well. And with it, we're going to be going back to this other point I have off to the side here. The second law states that energy, that each time energy is transferred, amount of usable energy decreases. So one way you can kind of think about that simplistically is just the internal combustion engine of a car. We're taking the chemical energy, the potential energy, whatever you want to think of it as, the stored energy of the bonds of gasoline, and we're burning it, and we're just not burning it. We can never get to 100% efficiency in terms of converting that energy from one form to another. There's always going to be a little bit of energy loss, usually in the form of heat. And in terms of energy, we've got what are known as primary producers. So these are going to be organisms that produce their own energy. And we've got off to the side here, chemosynthesis. You're probably familiar with photosynthesis. It's going to be a similar idea. Photosynthesis, they're taking the energy of the sun to produce the energy of sunlight to produce their acquire energy, essentially. Chemosynthesis, the same idea. It's just in this case, they're using chemicals to extract that energy. So this occurs in deep sea vents in the ocean, high temperatures. Sulfur compounds are going to be related, and then they can actually sort of, through their through this chemosynthesis process, they're able to take the chemicals, convert them, and then get energy out of that process. But again, this is going to be a very, very sort of specialized process. It doesn't occur with many organisms, and it doesn't occur in many ecosystems. Photosynthesis, yes, but this chemosynthesis much less frequently. But photosynthesis, you're probably much more familiar with. Again, just the conversion of sunlight so that the plants can acquire energy through the production of glucose. Also helps a little bit with global warming because the plants take carbon dioxide, so they remove that from the atmosphere and are producing oxygen instead. But again, this is going to be an example of a primary producer because they're producing their own energy. And this is going to be the basis of, I'm getting a little ahead of myself, but this is going to be the basis of any ecosystem, of any food web or food chain, however you want to think about it. We're going to see in a second, we're going to focus on the food web. But the primary producers are going to be the basis of any of those ecosystems. They're going to be what are providing the most energy and are going to be sort of the foundation in terms of the energy for that system. But just sort of as an aside, if you want to see sort of why the colors changed, I've included this link that so ESF is just back in New York, one of the state schools, environmental science and forestry. So they're just a SUNY school, which is the State University of New York system, and they're focused pretty much just focused on environmental science. So it's a pretty neat institution, but this link just gives you a little bit of information if you've ever wondered on why leaves change colors. So it's actually just different pigments, different substances in those leaves that play different roles. And then as the temperature changes, as the amount of sunlight changes, the plant is kind of signaled to produce more or less of these. And that's what gives them the characteristic colors of green or yellow, orange, red that we see in the fall. But whereas primary producers do something like chemosynthesis, photosynthesis to produce their own energy, animals, for the most part, are incapable of doing that. So we're relying on cellular respiration. So this is taking glucose, and again, it's going to be coming from the plants that produce it via photosynthesis, or it's going to be sort of through an intermediate where it's coming from an animal that had eaten one of those plants, or it could be even a longer string of that, but essentially it's going to be tied back to those plants. And this is going to be how the animals are, like us, humans, other animals are able to produce their energy. And if we look, they're going to be very similar equations, just sort of in reverse. And when we're looking at these ecosystems, like I said, it's going to be comprised of the water, the air, the soil, but it's also going to be made up of those different organisms within. So we want to have a term so that we can make sure that what we're describing is well understood by everybody. So when we're looking at a species is going to be an organism that are genetically similar enough to breed and produce fertile offspring. So one example of, I can never remember what it was, I should have looked it up, but there's a horse and a donkey, I think, produce a mule, but that mule isn't fertile, so that mule can't have any offspring. So because of that, horses and donkey aren't considered the same species. Whereas things like dogs would be, even though we could have, like, I have a red heeler, my parents have a Labrador, whatever. You see people mixing different breeds, but those breeds in general, I would assume, are still, like, there may be definitely some ethical concerns with that, but they could have offsprings themselves. So those are considered the same species. Population. Now we're looking at the members of a species that live in the same area at the same time. So just because two animals are the same species doesn't mean we're necessarily going to consider them the same population if they're living in two different areas. Depending on the scale of the area we're focused on, they could be. But if they're separated by a lot of space, we may consider them two different populations, unless we're looking at it sort of as a global perspective. So population can kind of vary depending on the scale we're looking at. And even population, sometimes we're not referring to just one single species. Sometimes we'll be looking at the entire the area. So that one can get a little bit confusing. Because that kind of goes with community, but sometimes those get used sort of interchangeably. But generally, I'll try to make it as clear as possible what we're referring to with those. And then, like I said, the ecosystem is going to be sort of the collection of all of those different pieces. So it's the environment itself in terms of the landscape, the water, the air, the soil, the rocks, whatever may be located there, and then the different organisms that are living there on top of that. And then with those ecosystems, there's going to be what are known as trophic levels, which is going to be tied into the food web or the food chain. We're going to be thinking of it in the sense of a food web, because the food chain kind of thinks of it in terms of sort of single connections between different things at trophic levels, where it's really going to be sort of a mishmash of everything's connected. There's going to be multiple predators for different prey. So we don't want to just have it kind of going linearly with just one thing. We want to have a wider scope to it. It's going to be same general idea. It's just going to be a little bit more going on probably when we look at it. But the trophic level is just going to kind of be the position it's at in relation to the different organisms there. So we'll see the primary producers, things like plants. Those are going to be the lowest trophic level. Then the herbivores, the things that eat those plants, are going to be one above it. And then we'll have the carnivores above that, but we'll see that in a second. And I was actually getting ahead of myself, so here we go. Consumers get their energy from producers, so that's why we're going to see the consumers higher up on these trophic levels. Herbivores, so if you think about herbs, just going to be related to the plants that you can cook with. So herbivores are just going to be the organisms that eat those plants. And I should say it doesn't necessarily just have to be grass, could be other plants as well. But these are going to be considered primary consumers. So again, we were talking about primary producers before. They produce their own energy. Herbivores are going to be considered primary consumers because they're going to be the first thing that actually eats something else. So they would be the second trophic level in that case, because it's going to be primary producers at the bottom. These herbivores, these primary consumers, are going to be next. And then above that, we're going to see the carnivores and the omnivores. So the carnivores eat meat, omnivores eat both plants and meat. And these are going to be then from the third level upwards. And depending on exactly what ecosystem you're looking at, those levels, depending on exactly what's in there, is going to vary. How many levels we have above the third can vary, but the general framework is going to be following this system where we've got the primary producers at the bottom, primary consumers one above that, and then we've got the other consumers afterwards. So if you can see this kind of a little blurry here, like I was saying, primary producers at the bottom, primary consumers one up, and then we've got secondary consumers. So these are going to eat the primary consumers. Tertiary just means third. So tertiary consumers, so these snakes are going to eat the mice, which are going to eat the crickets, which are going to eat the plants. And then in this case, the quaternary consumers at the very top would then eat the snake, so the hawk or whatever bird that's going to be. And this is kind of the food chain. This is the simplistic version. The food web, kind of the same idea. It's just got a little bit more going on because it's not just going to be the hawk's not just going to only eat snakes. The snake's not only going to eat mice. The mouse isn't only going to eat crickets, and so on. So we're going to have these interconnections here. So if you look here, just going from the grass, we've got crickets, we've got deer, we've got rabbits. The rabbit then is eaten by the fox and the owl, but the owl also eats squirrels, also eats this other bird, and so on. So we can see that there's a lot of things going on here. And with these, we can kind of think of it in terms of a pyramid, excuse me, of biomass. So biomass is just referring to the amount of biological material. So for primary consumers at the bottom, that's just how much of that plant or how much of the phytoplankton, if we're looking at an aquatic system. And then above that would be the primary consumers, secondary consumers, tertiary consumers, and upwards. And what we're seeing is that each time we go one trophic level higher, we're going to see that about 90% of that biomass is lost, or only 10% of it remains. It's basically why we're moving the decimal over one each time. So we go from 1 million kilograms to 100,000 to 10,000 to 1,000. And that's going to be because there's energy losses as we go from one trophic level to the other. If you think about it, when you're eating, when the phytoplankton is, or the grass is eaten by the grasshopper, all of that mass isn't converted directly into mass in the grasshopper. Some of it's going to be used as energy, burned off as energy, I should say. So that's why we see the decreases in the biomass from one trophic level to the next. And again, about 90% of it decreases. So what you can do is just move that decimal over one for each trophic level we move over, or move up rather. So that's why in this case, 15,200. We go 2 trophic levels up, it's only 152 because they just move that decimal over 2. So 15,200, move it over 2, just becomes 152 kilograms in that case. And then this is just showing it a little bit better, I think. And again, I like this one because it's showing that heat loss. So 20,000 kilocalories to 2,000 to 200 to 20 to 2. And again, because the remainder there is being burnt off as heat and other forms of energy. And then this one's also showing that ultimately all of these organisms are going to die out. Not go from extinction, but just them individually are going to die out, and then the decomposers then break them down. I'm going to pause this for a second. All right, finally, with the biogeochemical cycles, sounds pretty complicated, but what we're looking at here is just the movement of certain nutrients. So we're looking at water, carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur specifically. But it's just looking at the movement of those different nutrients throughout the environment, those different spheres. So the atmosphere, the lithosphere, hydrosphere, biosphere, whatever it's going to be. And then the different forms that those are going to take. So in some cases, for example, we'll see nitrogen going to be slightly different forms in different areas in the environment. But we will go through those. So first, the water cycle. Probably the one that you're most familiar with of all of those different cycles. But this is, like I said, just looking at the movement, and we'll go through each of these a little bit more in depth at different points throughout the quarter, but just the movement of these different substances throughout the environment. So with the water, we're familiar with precipitation, so whether it's rain or snow, the reverse being evaporation from lakes and rivers, oceans, whatever it may be. But things that sometimes get overlooked is going to be things like snow melt, which actually can supply the water for those different surface bodies of water, so lakes and rivers. Similarly, runoff from agriculture. So a lot of the times that can actually bring in pollutants into the water. So things that are on that agricultural field can get run off with the water into the lake or ocean, whatever it's going to be. And we'll talk about that a little bit actually with the phosphorus and the nitrogen cycles. Of course, cloud formation can actually play a pretty big part in the weather that's experienced in a certain area, in terms of the sunlight as well as the temperature. And then what often gets the most overlooked is probably this movement throughout the earth itself. So groundwater can actually travel, and then a lot of the times this groundwater is used for drinking water and things like that. So if this groundwater gets contaminated, it's almost impossible to really deal with. So that just basically ruins a water supply, and that can be an issue with fracking, which is going to be something else we'll talk about later on in the quarter. But the next one, we're looking at the carbon cycle. And this one has a couple different pieces to it. So we've got things like industry burning fossil fuels, and that could also be things like cars. So it doesn't just have to be corporations, it's things we do as individuals as well. But corporations do their fair share of burning fossil fuels. We've got animals as well. So respiration is going to produce carbon dioxide. Photosynthesis, if you think about it, is going to then sort of remove some of it. But there's carbon in living organisms. So when those organisms die, that carbon is going to get broken down in the soil. And then with the carbon cycle, one thing we're also going to talk about that sometimes gets overlooked is this ocean uptake. So the oceans can actually serve as sort of a sink for excessive carbon dioxide production. So as we burn more fossil fuels, as we produce more carbon dioxide, we have more of it in the atmosphere. Some of that actually sort of dissolves into the ocean, and that can cause problems for the ocean. It helps protect the atmosphere, but it can cause some issues with acidifying the ocean. But that's going to be another piece of the carbon cycle. And we'll look at that when we really look at climate change. The nitrogen cycle, this one a little bit more complicated, just at look like the face value of it, but nitrogen in the atmosphere is N2, so that's actually the majority of the atmosphere is nitrogen. But this form of nitrogen, isn't actually usable for plants. So what we have occurring is in the soil, there's what's known as nitrogen fixing bacteria. And this bacteria changes this nitrogen into different forms. So NH3 is going to be ammonia. NH4 should have a positive sign. Same thing with these NO2 and NO3. They should be negative. But these different forms of nitrite, nitrate, ammonium, different forms of nitrogen that are usable by the plants. And then there's also processes that essentially do the opposite, denitrify it, return it back to just the regular N2. And then with these, the reason the arrows are coming here from the animal is because ammonia, and it should be NH3, or this should be ammonium with a positive sign. But those are going to be products that often come in the waste of organisms. So if you think about, particularly if you've had a cat, you can also often smell that ammonia smell. It's because they're actually producing it in their urea. But also lightning can actually do some of the same thing that this nitrogen fixing bacteria does. But traditionally, it's going to be the nitrogen fixing bacteria that kind of changes this atmospheric nitrogen into something that the plants can actually use. And then with nitrogen, It'll be somewhat related to phosphorus in that they're both going to be sometimes run off into the water, and that can actually cause problems for the organisms there. It can oversupply nutrients, which creates an algal bloom, which then can basically kill off a lot of the different organisms in that water. But with phosphorus, it does have obviously benefits for fertilizer, but you got to be careful about how you use it. We'll talk about that later in the quarter too. But phosphorus can come from just the weathering of rocks that contain phosphorus, contain phosphate in particular. Animals, whether they eat plants with phosphorus in it or they're just exposed to it in general, they're going to contain some phosphorus. So similar to the carbon cycle, when they die, they'll be decomposed, and some of that phosphorus is going to get into the environment that way. And then also there may be phosphate in the rock bed of different water systems that can actually sort of dissolve into the water. But again, with all these cycles, we're just looking at sort of the movement of these different nutrients throughout the environment in sort of a basic way right now. And then later in the quarter, when it gets to the different chapters, we'll focus on some of these a little bit more specifically. But finally, the sulfur cycle. So if you look, the big production of these is going to come from smelting and burning of fossil fuels. So fossil fuels sometimes also release sulfur. Smelting is going to be sort of a process where they purify different types of metal, but it also releases pollutants into the atmosphere. And even things like volcanoes erupting can release sulfur into the atmosphere. And this is going to be problematic because these sulfur compounds, same thing with the nitrogen actually, can form acid in the atmosphere, which is then going to deposit as just acid rain or acid snow. And then that's going to obviously have issues because we're adding acid to the environment. Depending on where it is, it's going to have a different level of impact, but it's always not going to be something that's ideal. But I should say with the sulfur, particularly with the release of it into the atmosphere from burning and smelting, we have been able to reduce that quite a bit recently, and acid rain hasn't been as much of a problem as it was in the 20th century.